Hello, welcome to the Awakening Educator. I'm Susan Andrian, and unfortunately, my co-host Megan Sweet is not with us today, but I am so excited to interview Susan Bauer, the author of Embodied Teen. Welcome, Susan. We're so glad that you were able to join the Awakening Educator and our audience. We're missing Megan, but we're so happy you're here. I'd love to have you introduce yourself to our audience and let them know who you are and what you're doing, and before we get into it.
Okay, great. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I was so inspired to find out more about the podcast and the work you're doing and the work Megan is doing, that we're all really holding a vision for change. So I'm sure we'll have some time to talk about my vision of that and what we're looking at. So I wear several different hats, actually. So I'll give a little bit of my background. I have primarily first a dance background, so an MA and an MFA in dance. And then as part of my dance training, I started studying experiential anatomy, and which led me to this study of somatics. So now I'm also a registered somatic movement educator and therapist. So I have a private practice, work with individuals. And then I've really worked in all different spheres of education, in middle school, high school, and college level as a professor, so teaching all the different age levels. And now the other piece that I'm doing, from having worked all those years with these different ages, is a teacher training. So I have an organization called Embodiment in Education. And I work with teachers, training them in this kind of somatic practice to bring this more to youth. So I can talk about how I got started with youth a little bit if you want.
Yeah, I think we always love to hear the origin of, our stories or journeys, and they often have these like cyclical ways in which we come to the point that we're at right now and where we're going. So I would love to hear how you ended up working with youth and how that fit into the larger picture of your journey.
Yeah, so when I graduated, I went to Middlebury College in Vermont, and when I graduated, I moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, primarily to work with Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who's body-mind centering. So that's a big part of my training, as well as work in ideokinesis. And then I started working at a private high school as a dance faculty. And of course, anyone who's worked in high school, and I pretty much saw right away, wow, there's so many issues with the body and with feeling comfortable in themselves and with injury and with also a lot of stereotypical ideas about their own bodies. And it just seemed like a lot that wasn't really getting addressed anywhere. So I started developing this course. At the time, I think we called it kinesthetics, because they didn't want like anatomy in the word or something.
It's always those like finding the right language that isn't going to freak people out.
That's right. Yeah. So long story short, I pretty much developed that over a 12-year period. And what I felt I was doing was, my experience with somatics was as an adult, really, or, younger adult. But I really began to feel that what I was seeing, this was on my own perspective, was that this whole field of somatics had in a way developed for generations of adults who knew nothing about their bodies and really didn't have these kind of skills for inner body listening and for self-care. And that this whole realm, it was like we developed it for adults because we'd all been dysfunctional or conditioned to live more in our head and our intellect and disconnect from our bodies. So I just felt, why wait until we're adults and we need this? So I thought I would just start using this with teens. Well, what I found was that did not go very well right away.
That's often how we really learn things, right?
Yeah.
When things don't go well.
I felt I took about a 12-year period to look at how could I make this relevant to them, so that it wasn't like another subject coming at you. So much of what you need to learn in academics, which is important, is outer information. But when you're approaching your own body, you don't want someone coming at you as if they know more than you do.
Yeah.
Especially when you're a teenager.
Right. As a teenager, you don't want anyone to tell you
exactly
anything.
So how to do this so they felt they had agency and that it was really meaningful to them. And I felt like that's really started to happen. So during my graduate work at Wesleyan University, while I was still teaching in private high schools, probably not that same one, I went to several different ones, I started writing this curriculum up as my master's thesis and saying, all right, what am I doing and why is it effective and what are some of the principles? And anyway, that's what has evolved over whatever now 30 years of teaching that, and also in Asia and looking at different cultural perspectives. Into my book, I think I'm going to show you. I see it in the Embodied Team, where I really put the curriculum together and also tried to frame it in relationship to why and what's going on in education now and how is it relevant to what people are interested in now. I could talk more about that, but.
Yeah, it's how I found your book, how I first found your book, and then decided, to reach out because I really wanted to talk to you more about it with our audience. Was I'm going to be working with Destiny Arts, which is an organization here in the Bay Area, which I think you're familiar with. They're a really powerful youth serving organization that does movement arts and a lot of healing through movement arts, although they haven't had a clinical program. They haven't had a mental health program. And so they're wanting to capitalize on the movement work that they're doing that's already healing. And then how do we ground that in some real strong clinical practices, I'm taking on this role to help them develop a clinical program based in movement arts, which is how I found your book in the first place. And then I was so inspired by the thinking around it and all of the different all the different theories that you were pulling from or practices that you've been pulling from that have been in place for a really long time to create your own model. And then with some really practical tools for educators to be able to use that are really guided instruction that you can kind of open up and use it with some training and understanding of the body. There are some real practical things that folks can put into place. And I'm curious how you were able to cultivate those lessons. Like, how were you able to take all of these different related but different ways of looking at the body or goals of engaging with the body to create your specific curriculum?
Well, I think there's a couple things that I did, and some of them were done before me, and I drew on my teachers, and some of them were unique to me. So one of the things was, I think I mentioned that I studied experiential anatomy in college. That was with Karen McCose. And she and Andrea Olson now have a book called Body Stories, which you might be interested in, which in a way was really, I feel, was probably the first actual curriculum in that material that got developed. I actually was writing my Wesleyan thesis at the same time, so it was corresponding. But so there was some, groundwork in the way that Karen was presenting this kind of material in an educational context that I drew from. But I think the couple things that I did that were different, first of all, was I really held this vision to take this material out of a dance context. Now, Karen wasn't teaching it, just to dancers, but it was in the dance department. My feeling was, yes, this is really beneficial for dancers and for athletes. And it's also just kind of a common core subject that needs for everyone. This isn't just about getting a better arabesque or getting the basket in the hoop. This is really at the time, this whole idea of social emotional learning wasn't really a thing. But I was onto this. I was like, wait a minute, we need some time to understand ourselves in relationship to others, to look at our own body image. So I think that was one thing I did, was take it out of a dance context. It wasn't just for dancers. In fact, when I first taught it, people could get science credit or humanities credit. Where it's going to end up in the schools, where it lands is different in every context. Maybe it's in the health and wellness program, or maybe, like you're saying, in the mental health for Destiny or wherever. But so that was one thing, was I really saw it as a core subject. So then if you're going to do that, you have to kind of back up to what are the basic common denominators that I'm teaching. Right. That I want people to experience. So I think that's the other way that you're sort of saying, how did you get it to work, right?
Yeah.
So one of the core things is it's soma, We might as well back up and say, what is somatics, right?
Yeah.
So the word soma comes from the Greek somatikos, which means pertaining to the body. But using that term in the way we're talking about it was first developed by Thomas Hanna, who actually is in the Bay Area and is the founder of Hanna Somatics with his wife, Eleanor Criswell Hanna. And so Thomas Hanna developed this word soma, or took that word soma, and used it to distinguish, and here's the key difference, the lived body from just the body.
Yeah. So as we think about, like, right now in our culture, this moment we're in, which is, I feel like, an explosion of reassessing what's important to us and reassessing, and whenever there's an explosion or a transformational shift in a culture and a community, there's both pain and joy. And I have been interested in somatics for a while, but now I'm seeing it and hearing it everywhere. We're all, there's this collective connection with what's happening in our body. And what you're doing is a little bit different than most of the somatic work out there, because you're also including anatomy in a way that I think is different than some of the somatic experiences that I have had.
Yes, let me talk about that a moment. So this soma, the lived body, meaning that we're including our subjective experience. And the reason that got distinguished was it was in comparison maybe to like the medical model, where you're often your body's just an object, or even the people who study medicine are looking at cadavers. They're not looking at movement in the lived body. So that was one thing. The other thing was, and it's happening more and more today as doctors shift their training, but people weren't looking at your own subjective experience of living in your body. And so somatics was trying to look at movement patterns, but also how you're experiencing your body. So the difference you're speaking about when you say, well, but actually you're unique because you're including anatomy, I actually don't think I am. But I think the difference is there's different so here's like the umbrella of somatics, right? And then different aspects of that. I think the aspect that's coming more into the mainstream that you might be referring to is somatic psychology. And so that's looking more at the body in relationship to the psyche, but it's kind of starting with the psyche and also including the body. Whereas most somatic practices in this somatics, the somatic movement education disciplines are based in anatomy physiology, and they're based in movement patterns and repatterning and a really deep understanding of our lived body in that kind of way. So I think this, like the things like Feldenkrais and Alexander, body-mind centering, ideokinesis, all of those have a very strong anatomy physiology basis.
Yeah, the pain, physical, the huge growing need to address chronic and physical pain and things like what you're mentioning. Yeah, I guess I was sort of thinking somatic psychology because that's where I spend most of my thinking and living. But I agree, there's these both happening at the same time, and I appreciate that your model has both the subjective and the objective parts of what's happening in the body. And as I started to take on this role with Destiny Arts, and I'm just still very much getting my feet on the ground, I guess is the best way to getting my body situated in this organization.
Even that term, right? Our feet on the ground. We live subjective. It's in our language. You know that feeling, and it's different than not having your feet on the ground, right?
Yeah, it's when you're with this floaty feeling. But we did, as part of the initial work, we created a screener for the dance company. And what surprised me, because these young folks are so powerful in their body and they present with so much awareness of their body and movement and confidence, that body image was still one of the number one issues of concern that came up for these really confident, really powerful young people. Body image was still a huge issue. And thinking about this curriculum and how you evolved it to help them both be aware of their body, but work through some of the complexities of being an adolescent in our culture with all different kinds of body types and all the different kinds of body shapes, and how our world reinforces that.
Yeah, great. I would love to speak to that. So that relates to just the last thing you asked of how did you make it relevant? So I made it relevant by including their subjective experience and helping them learn about their own bodies, which no, there wasn't that avenue unless you were learning just from the purely scientific, where you're looking at pictures in a book, but not related to your own body. But then the second thing I was doing is exactly what you're talking about, is I felt like, and I feel like, a lot of these issues around body awareness and body image come from unconscious conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is that you're going in your whatever culture you're living in, and you're absorbing the attitudes around you. But you don't necessarily become conscious of what attitudes you're holding, but they're still impacting you. They impact how you feel about yourself. They impact how you look at others. So, if I'm like sitting here like this, you have one feeling about me, or if I'm like this, you might have another feeling, or, we have all these responses and reactions to people. So what I started to do was actually to create specific activities. And I did that because one of them is about posture.
Yeah.
To take kids through different things. Like, all right, if you shift your head a little bit this way, how does that feel in your body? Or if you shift your head a little back, what happens in your torso and how does that feel? And then walk around and see each other like this. How does that feel to be seen like this versus like this? So I created what I call evocative invitations.
Evocative invitations.
It's not in my book. I made it up right now.
Yeah. Oh, good.
That's the idea. It's an evocative invitation. In other words, I'm creating a safe container to then intentionally bring up our more unconscious, maybe stereotypes or attitudes, so that then we can talk about them and look at them and see, well, where did that come from? And do I really want to hold that? Or is it repressing me? Do I feel oppressed? Or is it oppressing someone else when I put that perspective on them? So it really gives you a chance to slow down and notice these things in your own lived experience and share them honestly with each other. And you get more choice in how you respond.
Because you're aware of what.
Because you're aware. You're not just unconsciously repeating it again and again.
Mm-hmm. And the evocative is, I spent a lot of time thinking about the evocative. Dr. Bruce Perry, who's the model that I tend to ground most of my work in, talks a lot about the evocative cues.
I never knew that.
Yeah. And so it's a central concept for this model of like starting to be able to identify what are the evocative cues in the environment. And so if we can connect that also to the body and how we're responding with our physical to those evocative cues that then reinforce that feeling, or to be able to embody a different posture or movement. I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding what you're talking about, so you can feel what that feeling is and change the way you're holding the energy in your body so that it doesn't give the same kind of powerlessness or fear or threat response.
Well, I think it's more about feeling who you are and what's your identity, rather than just taking on an identity because you think you should be that way and your culture's telling you, but maybe you've known inside it doesn't feel right. So I feel like it and it also brings more compassion between people because you recognize, oh yeah, I was judging you for that.
Right.
And is that really fair? Like, how would it feel to be judged that way because I happen to have my hair this way, or because I stand like that, or, well, let's say I'm just throwing out an example. Let's say I had a lot of ballet training and this is how I stand, but it doesn't mean I'm snobby. Why does everyone not want to be friends with me because I stand like this? Or, these just different things happen.
Yeah, I there's so many threads right now that I'd love to pull on. I want to take a really quick break. If you're with us on Facebook, just stay where you are. We're literally going to go off and come right back on. And when we come back, I'd love to hear about some of what you're bringing up in a time of social media is what's a little bit resonant for me right now, and thinking about teens in particular and how they are presenting their body and how they feel about themselves in a social media context versus their lived experience, and how so often there's so much disconnect, and how we can bring folks up. I know we didn't have that conversation before, but as you were talking, I was like, that's such a big part of young people's image of their body in this moment, and us as adults too, right? We're kind of intertwined in this way. So I'd love to hear how you might incorporate that or think about it as part of the curriculum and education as young people are struggling with their online image versus their self image and the way they experience that in their lived bodies. So we'll be back in about 2 seconds for those of you with us on Facebook or YouTube. Welcome back. I'm Susan Andrian, and my amazing co-host Megan Sweet is not with us today, but I am here with Susan Bauer. We are having an amazing conversation about her book, The Embodied Teen, and her work with somatics and young people. And before we went out, Susan was sharing about just this experience of the evocative and working with the evocative in relationships. And it raised for me the question around for young people, their online social media body versus their lived body, and how maybe how that's evolved in your curriculum as social media has become more embedded, and how you maybe play with that in the curriculum.
Yeah, so I don't think I actually have played with that in the curriculum. I do play with using technology and sort of, how you use your phone and what kind of posture it creates and what it does to your lungs and kind of like that. I think the one place, well, let me just say one thing about it though. I think it almost reminds me of, in a dance class for a long time, the whole idea was to have mirrors. And so the way you know if you're in the right shape is you look in the mirror. And then as modern dance evolved, all of a sudden they started wanting a budget for mirrors. For curtains, to put curtains over the mirrors, because they wanted students to locate by feeling where they were in space, looking at the correct shape. Did I get it right or not? I think it's a similar thing. There's a tendency to look at how I'm projecting and what the image is versus what is really me and my body and how I'm, like you said, how I'm living in myself. So I think even by going through some of this kind of curriculum, it begins to shift that perspective. I think it actually would address that, but not actually at this point, not directly. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to look at the way young people present themselves in social media pre-engaging in this curriculum, if there's any shifts in the way that they're more authentically themselves, if they are more grounded in their body and feeling more connected with their body and less of that sort of shame or disconnection around it.
Well, actually, I love that you said that, and I'm not going to read a lot from my book, but what I really tried to do is put quotes by students in here. So that reminded me of one of them, and I'm going to read it.
Perfect.
And I'll see. I think it's the first one I marked, so I think I should be able to find it.
Yeah, there's a lot of great youth voice in your book, and I really appreciated that as well.
Thank you. It's important because it's one thing to say this will work, but then what do the students feel? Okay, so this was a quote by, I think she was maybe 10th grade, 11th grade. I started out feeling very self-conscious in this class. I think I was afraid of my body. But being aware of what's in my body and how I move makes me more at ease. Having the knowledge about my body allows me to be a little more confident.
That's what you want that's what we want for all of our young people and our girls. I think for all of our young people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think another example, this reminds me because we both went like this.
Yeah.
Another activity we do relates to breathing. And so we're learning about our ribs and our lungs and our diaphragm and sort of, about our body. But we also do a more subjective activity where I have them do some journal writing, like free response writing where you just write. And one of them is, I can breathe more easily when, ... And it's harder for me to breathe when, ... And it's really beautiful to see the awareness of like what stresses me out, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I could have used this prompt 2 days ago. I was really having a hard time getting the exhale.
Mm.
I was able to breathe in, but I'm going through a big transition of leaving my job and time to let go and letting go of a lot of this work that I've been holding. I did some equine work yesterday with an amazing
Mm.
practitioner, and as soon as I got in that space, I was able to breathe out. But just as you were saying that, and I was lucky because I'm aware enough of my body, and I'm aware enough of what was happening in that moment because of my own practices and my own experience, that I didn't get scared when I couldn't breathe out. But I can imagine if I'm a young person or somebody who doesn't have that awareness in that moment, that it's very scary when something like that's happening in your body. So just even in that one example of myself, I can see how that education of awareness. Okay, I know there's nothing wrong with me in the medical sense. This is a stress related response.
Right. And then the word that's coming to me is resourced.
Mm-hmm.
So first we have to get the awareness, and
Mm-hmm.
then we have to have some resources to then know, well, then now what?
Right. Right.
But I find today many people don't even have that level of, well, many people, it's like
Mm-hmm.
people are stressed, and teens especially, so they don't
Mm-hmm.
even have that level of awareness. You know,
Yeah.
I'm thinking of SEL.
Mm-hmm.
Those different five, core factors. Well, one of them is self-regulation. And
Mm-hmm.
some educators have even said that's like the prime most important one.
I would say it is.
Yeah. But what I try when I talk about this in my book is that you actually can't have any level of self-regulation if you don't first have self-awareness.
Hmm.
And the kind of body this kind of awareness that somatics develops is actually inner body awareness. So your interoception, your proprioception, for you to even notice I can't breathe out, that's a skill level that needs, I feel at this level of teenage years, needs to get developed.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying, and I agree on some level. And I work a lot with little ones, and so sometimes with the little ones, I'll just start doing games that help them regulate their body, and they're not really aware that that's what I'm doing in that
Yeah,
moment,
yeah,
where I'll do something like they're really upset and having a really big moment, and I'll just start playing I Spy, which is a somatic grounding. That I'll just start out of the blue, and they'll look at me like and then they'll just start playing, and it's a grounding activity. So yes, and I think our goal is to get that like acknowledgement when it's happening. And in a school setting, especially with the younger ones, sometimes I'm just needing to provide them the
yeah.
somatosensory regulating opportunity in the moment. And then I want to give them the awareness so that the next time they're having that out of control body feeling, they remember some of the skills that they used in the moment with with awareness.
Yeah, so what you're doing is you're giving them the embodied experience first, and then you're
Mm-hmm.
drawing on that later to help educate them. That's kind of how I do this work also. The only thing I will emphasize, I'm glad you brought up little ones, particularly what I'm advocating for in this kind of curriculum I developed, it's not for elementary school. What they
Right.
need is very different. They need what you're doing. But then when you
Right.
get to middle school, high school, you're starting college, there's a whole other level of awareness that you really can develop. So I agree with you. I
Absolutely.
don't
Yeah.
advocate for this for elementary kids.
Yeah. And so I'd love to actually get into the curriculum.
Well, yeah.
You have eight pedagogy principles that you outline in the book. And we could go through all of them, but there's a couple that I'm really interested in. And so maybe we can list what they all are, and then we can dig into a couple of the ones that I'd love to dig in a little deeper on.
Okay. Do you think we could back up 1 minute and then do that? Because what I'm thinking is
Sure.
um, the pedagogy principles are kind of like the overarching or the under foundation of how would you teach all of this. but I feel like maybe some people listening might even know what this is. So I thought I'd just look a little at the contents, like what are you teaching them? Does that be right? And then
great. Let's do that. Let's do it.
So anyway, the first part I'll just mention a case for somatic movement education for teens. The first chapter is why teach teens about their bodies. So this chapter, for anyone who's interested in the more, I really look at what's going on in our culture. How did this happen? And then, why is this important? I also look at how it relates to some of the national standards in health and wellness and dance and PE. I also look at how it's similar and different from mindfulness or social emotional learning. So anyway, anyone interested in that we can talk about it more, but can look at that. And then I go over a little bit about what is somatic education and what are some of the disciplines, a little bit what we talked about before. And then there's basics about the curriculum, the key pedagogy points that we'll come back to. The language of embodiment, how do you actually guide things? What words do you use that are effective versus maybe repressive or triggering or all of that? It's very complicated. And then there's a chapter on touch and other touchy subjects.
Love that.
Working with intentional touch, guidelines for teaching touch, stress, trauma, and sexuality. So anyway, that's the framework. And we're going to look a little more at the pedagogy part of that framework. But then what's the content? So there's two parts of the curriculum, which is the embodied anatomy. And I'll just read the chapter headings for you to get a little idea.
Great.
Body listening, which I think many people are familiar with now, a little bit from body scanning, and they use that a lot in mindfulness. Body systems, and that includes inside the body, and then the cultural body, which relates a little more to that conversation of how do you feel about what's in there and where does that come from. Movement integration. And then there's a chapter on the skeletal system where we go through perception of the skeleton, the nature of bone, tracing the bones. There's a section on joints, proprioception, and the kinesthetic sense. So how do you know? How do you move? How do you know how to move? How do you remember movement? Like what's happening in our bodies? There's a chapter on organs. So in addition to our framework and our skeleton, what's inside the framework? And how does that move and support our movement and bring aliveness to our movement? Fascia and movement qualities. Then the second part is applying some of that to specific aspects like structure and posture that we just talked about, which some of it gets into the social somatics, it might be called, is the cultural conditioning or the unconscious biases that we hold. It's getting even more important these days to bring consciousness and be a little more compassionate with. The dynamics of balance, looking at our spine, our pelvis, breathing basics. And that's a big chapter on a lot of things. Talked about the hug of the lungs and the heart or the ribs and looking at the diaphragm. There's also a section called the breath of life, which is looking at what's called ecosomatics. How does our breath and our lived biosphere in here relate to the biosphere out here and the rest of the planet? And a last chapter on a somatic warm-up. How do you take some of all these skills and know how to just have some time in your own day to move? And what might that look like from this perspective?
Yeah. Thank you for giving that framework, because I think it does really help to see how the book is organized and broken down and thinking about these pedagogy principles. There were maybe we can read through them really briefly and then lift up a couple that I really wanted to highlight in terms of it connecting to some of the work that I'm doing and was thinking about. Would love to kind of think where the overlap and how we can move some of this work forward. I really believe in collective healing. And as I said at the beginning, I think we're in this energetic shift in the world, and where we're going, I'm not really sure, but the pandemic, along with a number of other things, has really had us all rethinking a lot. and we feel it in our bodies. And I just feel like we're reimagining our relationship with our bodies and with the world. So I could read through the principles, or if you want to kind of share them briefly, it's up to you.
I could share them briefly. I might do it from the appendix because that just has like one sentence about each of them, and then whatever will go where you would like to go with that after it.
Perfect.
So the first one is a balancing objective and subjective experience. And we talked about that a lot just now, that it has to be about me. It's not just coming at me. And I have a core principle for each one, so I'll just read that. To facilitate a somatic experience requires an approach to the body and movement that's inclusive of both objective information and one's subjective experience. While information can be learned, true knowledge comes from one's own lived experience. There's more, but I'll go on.
And so this piece, before we go on, maybe, because there's a couple of comments I want, and this is one of the ones I was actually curious about from the perspective of the neurosequential model and Dr. Bruce Perry's work, where we think about this catalog of experiences, and particularly around relational experiences and both developmental trauma or healthy attachment, and the way that organizes the brain and body around threat and safety, sense of threat and sense of connection. And that there's this bottom up, top down, right? The way that our bodies are integrated. I think sometimes a lot of our approaches to those traumas are to try and think our way out of it, which is what you're talking about, is this subjective versus the objective. Like, how are we connecting to the body to create a sense of safety and supporting young people to accurately read what's happening in their life and what's happening in their world in that very moment? Is that kind of what part of it is about?
So I would say no, but I think it's very important what you're talking about. And it's a very important piece of the whole picture, but it isn't actually what I'm addressing here. So by saying no, it's not that no, that's important, it's just no. So I'll clarify what I'm talking about. By objective and subjective, I mean that thing we did when we both went, It's like we can see what it feels like to have a body response. So that's subjective. Or when you were talking about breathing and you couldn't exhale. But then can you also know the objective facts about the physiology of breathing to realize, oh, if I can't exhale, that means my diaphragm isn't doing a certain thing, whether it's coming up or down. I can know how to affect that in my body. So the objective refers to the objective anatomy.
That what's actually physiologically happening in that moment. So it might be the HPX, the stress response system, cortisol being pumped. Those are the objective pieces that are happening when you're having a stress response.
Right.
That change the way you're perceiving that moment. So when your body's being pumped up with cortisol, it's also changing your subjective experience in that moment. But if you can be aware, oh, my stress response has just been activated, I'm feeling unsafe, I'm aware that this is happening. I know that because my heart is racing. I feel that because I'm getting a little hot and my body's clenching up. So I'm aware that I'm in this stress response. And then the work might be to then know the physiological objective things you can do to help. Oh, if I take a deep breath, or I ground my hands on, or I do some patterned rhythmic movement, this releases this, it calms my nervous system and the cortisol goes down and it allows me to go back to baseline. So is that an example of kind of putting it in the stress context?
Yes. So that would be a great example of taking this pedagogy principle and applying it to this context that you're thinking of and teaching in. The kind of place that I might be applying it is maybe more like, I'll give an example of the spine. When I have people draw the skeleton, one of the things they always draw when I have them draw from the side is this like straight line of your spine. Well, sit up straight, and all these language things that make you think you have a straight spine. And if you feel that and think that way, you almost inevitably put a little tension in your spine to make it straight, because it actually isn't. It actually has these beautiful curves. The cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacrum. And when you can feel that they can exist and be a lived relationship in your body, rather than you have to hold a straight spine, it impacts how you feel and how you move. So the objective information is, yeah, we're going to learn about the actual curves of the spine, and we're going to sit in partners and feel them and see, oh yeah, this goes in and this comes out and this goes in a little bit. So we get to know it in our own body. But the subjective part would be, first, what's my perception of my spine? What did I draw? How does it feel to me? So we're doing both. We're not just looking at the anatomy, but we're looking at the anatomy in relation to how I'm living in my own body. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. Yeah, it does. I think there's learning that kind of the concepts or learning that can be used in lots of different contexts to help young people live in the world that they live in. But you're really just giving the skills around how do you know what's happening in your body? What is your body? And then what does it feel? How do you even be aware of what you're feeling in any given moment?
Yeah.
And it almost sounds like foundational to being able to live in your body in the world.
That's right. And I actually really appreciate the way you apply it to your interest and your, to looking at cortisol and stress, because I think that's a lot of how, at least I don't know a lot about it, but my experience of mindfulness curriculums, they're really helping young people understand what happens when I'm stressed. So they're learning about the amygdala and cortisol and serotonin, and that's all really helpful. And I feel like this is another piece that's like, well, if you can learn about your amygdala, why can't you learn about your bones, or about your diaphragm and how it moves or doesn't move when you're stressed, or about the relationship with the heart and the lungs, and right? So yes, let's learn about all of it.
Right. All right, maybe let's go on to the next concept.
Yeah, and feel free if you have questions about one to just stop me like that.
Yeah. I'm sure I will, knowing me.
Okay. The next one is a student-driven curriculum, and this is really key. Core principle: start with what students already know and build on their interests from there. So should I go on?
Yeah, go on. I'm just gonna put that up there. I'll share it with you in a little bit, but we do have a question. Go on, and then we'll answer that question. Great. Or I'll give you an opportunity.
So start with what students already know and build on their interests from there. I'm going to see what I wrote that. When students are given a chance to discover what they already know and share that knowledge collectively, they gain confidence from progressing from where they actually are, rather than measuring themselves against some outside standard of what they believe they should know or have experienced.
I found this one, this is really important, and it's kind of central to a lot of the high quality education movement right now, and at least in Oakland and some of the other environments I'm there. But I also know that young people are highly self-conscious developmentally at that stage.
Yes.
And so I imagine they're reluctant, and you do go into this in the book, and you talk about sort of the evolution over time of how young people experience it. But I'm wondering, in a public school setting, how you, when kids are assigned to you to come, maybe they didn't choose this. Do you approach that differently than if you have a small group of young people who are sort of more engaged? And then we do have this really important question that was being asked, so I might pause us so that we can get to our listener question as well after.
Yeah, after, because I'll forget what you just asked me, and I might have already forgotten, but let me see. It was about, so would it be different in the different contexts? It might even be more so if people are in a more self-conscious context. And so let me explain why that is. What this principle means is, for instance, if we're going to look at the bones, let's say, we're not starting with, okay, class, here's the bones. This is the skull, these are the ribs, this is the humerus, radius and ulna, right? So we're going to get to that. But first, we're just starting with, can you lie down and feel the weight of your bones? And what can you picture? What do you know? What's a foot? What's an ankle? What are the bones in your lower leg? What's a knee? How does your lower leg connect to your upper leg? So we just go through the body like that. And then I have them draw. What do you know about what's in there? Just see what you picture and what do you see and what's your image? So in other words, we're starting with what they know and then we're building on there.
Okay.
So even if I'm going to go to name the bones, I won't start doing that. I'll say, well, who knows? Come on up and what can you name? And maybe they just say funny bone. Maybe it's not even an anatomy word. That's okay. Let's see what we know. So that's more what that principle means.
You start where they're at and go for and build on it, which also leads to that layered learning piece, which I think is the next.
And it also is important because it's also important because it kind of knocks the teacher off the pedestal of being the expert, which some teachers don't want that to happen. But in this kind of curriculum, you have to be in the place of like, we all have a body, we all move, we all know certain things and not other things. And I'm still learning and growing. I'm a student of embodiment, no matter how many years I've been on the planet. So let's see what we all know. So it's a really different approach.
So I don't think we're going to get to all of the pedagogies just looking at our time. And I do want to make sure that because we do want to have some audience participation. This is a pretty deep and big question. So I'm going to put it back up.
Okay.
Where is it? Come on. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I can read it if you want, and then we can go from there because it's a pretty meaty question. So just imagine how Black people came out of slavery into Jim Crow, into legal segregation, civil rights, affirmative action, the 80s and Reaganomics, and the following drug epidemic. What impact is that having on Black children and those who share the community with them? I know it's a whole dissertation, but if there's any kind of embodiment, because you do mention culture and cultural pieces in it, and we do know, like from the growing somatic Resmaa Menakem's work around the white supremacy body, how those things play out in terms of the intergenerational trauma that folks are holding.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think it's really bringing to the forefront in our culture now how much has been happening unconsciously out of bias that was not, it wasn't that it wasn't addressed, but it wasn't, the deep ramifications were not as in the forefront, and that we need to see the impact that our culture has on the personal body and the collective body. And so I think that's what's really come up now. And that's what I feel like this question is starting to point at. As far as what this kind of curriculum could do for that, I don't have the experience of what it has done because I haven't been in that in the Black community since, in the past 10 years with this thing. Not that it's only been 10 years, but I think some of what she's pointing at is what's been coming to the forefront more now. But what I do think is important is by creating a container for some of what's real for people to be held and expressed, there's inevitably going to be some time to deepen the awareness of what has actually happened and how it impacts us, both our own body and how we're treating others. So I think it's a real moment that somatics could play a deep part in the healing process. I also think it's very important to have people leading that who are of the same community. So part of what I'm interested in is having more and many of us in somatics having more diversity in the field, that there are people who can be leading this, like for instance at Destiny, who would be of that community.
Yeah, I know, Resmaa Menakem is doing some real deep somatic work and in affinity groups, and Pentress Hemferl, who is also in the both of them in the somatic psychology world of things, but doing some deep racialized trauma healing. And both of them make very clear that the healing has to happen for both the white body and the Black body. And I think often we talk about the need for healing for the Black body, but we ignore the responsibility of the white body to heal from the same kind of racialized trauma, and the role that our body and our ancestors' bodies have played in this dynamic of white body supremacy. And so I think the piece that you're bringing to the forefront around the need for young people to first even know what's happening in their body, what is in your body, what are the pieces, how does it feel, what's it like to live in a body in this culture, in this world. And then once you're aware of that, what's your responsibility to do your own work so that you're not causing harm on other bodies?
That's right. And that's the big piece, is so we're not repeating it. And if it's unconscious, then we're more apt to be repeating things that are really, if we had a deeper understanding of it, we might actually choose differently. And start to help contribute to, like you said, in a white body, contribute to the healing rather than keep re-traumatizing the situation. That's again, I'm glad you mentioned it was a dissertation, because it's a very big topic. And I also don't have huge experience in that realm. You mentioned, My Grandmother's Hands. You didn't say the name of his book. Yes, his work that's been very instrumental as well in this field. But
we're getting very close to running out of time. Okay. So I want to make sure, and we have a lot more we could talk about. I really want to make sure people know where to find you. If they want to buy your book, where's the best place to buy it? And if they want to learn more about opportunities to learn with you, because I think you mentioned you have a teacher school. So just want to make sure you have enough time to share about your work. So I'm going to actually pull us out really briefly so that when we come back, we can hear about where to find you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, welcome back. We are coming to the end of what could be a much longer, and it's a very enriching conversation. I think we have so much to learn and grow around our bodies. And so with that being said, we'd love to hear where our audience can learn more about your book, get your book, and learn more about the work that you're doing, or maybe get connected to some of that.
Great, thank you. So my website is just my name, Susan Bauer, BAUER.com, www.susanbauer.com. And then my embodiment and education program, you can find there as well, or you can go to embodimentineducation.org. And that will show you the program for teachers, or actually there's a course called Embodiment Essentials. It's a 25-hour online course if you just want to get the experience for yourself. And we begin to look at some of those pedagogy principles as well. How would you begin to translate some of this? I also have a private practice. I work with individuals. You can look about that on my website as well. And if you'd like to get my book, you can get it through North Atlantic Books, which is in Berkeley, which is my publisher. Or you can get it on Amazon. The benefit of that is that then if you would like to add your comments and a review, you're a verified purchaser or something, and that helps to get the word out about the book as well. Yes, I think that's that. I think, can I say a last thing here?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We don't have I am the producer and the host, so you get to say whatever you want to say in the end. I just wanted to make sure we had enough time where folks could hear where to find you.
Great. Thank you. It was something related to something you said at the end. Now I can't remember why I wanted to say this, but it was about if people start to get more aware of their bodies. So I just wanted to say, part of the issue here is, how do we do that?
Mm-hmm.
And the basic principle I want to just share is that first we're learning how to focus. And then where are we focused? We're not focused on our social media or on this. We're focused on our body. And then once we're focused on our body, and this is the key point that's often missing, we want to be focused on receiving information. And that's the bottom up versus top down that you were talking about. So often if we do focus on our body, it's to do something, or to get my, crunch abs in, or do that our best, right? So it's that's fine. We can achieve in our bodies too. And can we learn how to attend to our bodies in order to receive information, which is more that sort of parasympathetic nervous system sensing, that we're caught in that sympathetic nervous system action mode, right? As a culture. So that's part of the skill set that we're actually inviting people into, to balance we don't want one or the other, right? We just want to find a more balanced way to live in ourselves and our bodies.
Yeah. Susan, this was such a gift to talk with you. It was there, as I said, there's so many directions that we could go. I'm so grateful you're in the Bay Area and looking forward to figuring out ways that we can continue to connect and partner. And I'm sure our audience will be interested in seeing your book and learning more about what you're doing. We will be back. Megan will be back with us next time. Megan is actually at Harvard right now,
Yes.
doing a fellowship and learning even more because she's so smart. And so we missed her, but I'm sure she was sad that she couldn't make it, but we'll be back in a week or two. And thank you everyone for being with us. We'll see you next time.
Thank
Have
you
a
so
good
much for
evening.
having me, Susan.
Thank you.
Bye.